So what I want to talk about in this video is talking about effect size in substantive and economic significance. So this is kind of a really nerdy video, but I think it's very, very important for us to understand research. So if you don't know me, I'm an associate professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people to help me out that I want to pay the favor forward to help you out. So often when we look at regression variables, or when we're looking at some sort of data, we'd like to look at whether there is statistical significance between two variables or multiple variables, whatever we're trying to look at. And all that says is that there is a likelihood that these two things correlate together by a certain amount. But it doesn't say anything about what that certain amount is and what that sort of correlation actually looks like and how they vary together. And that is where effect size are really important to understand what the how much of an impact a variable has on something else. And that's where a lot of psychologists have been talking about effect sizes for a long time. So Cohen, I think it's Jacob Cohen, was talking about effect sizes for a very, very long time. And he sort of had this idea of, if we scale the how much the sort of total variance there is in the system, and you look at how much these two things change together, we can actually get some sort of effect. So there is an effect size, and we could sort of quantify what that is. So there is this variable that he came up with. It's called Cohen's D, and that was kind of the first sort of understanding of effect size, and that is basically the mean of the two variables, and you divide it by the standard deviation of the population. And really what we're trying to look at is like how large of an effect how much difference is there between these two different variables, and is that a substantial difference in the population of stuff that you're looking at, right? So that's one particular effect size, but there's all sorts of different kinds of ways to measure effect size. There's a whole bunch of different tables and sort of formulas that are out there. One of them is Cohen's D. The other one is, I think it's Hess's D. There's a bunch that are related to regression analysis. So there's Cohen's F and partial etas. There's all these sort of things, and really what you want to do after the fact, you sort of calculate them. I'm not going to get into the calculations of them because they're all pretty similar in terms of what they're trying to do, and they're trying to explain how much of the total variance of the thing that you're looking at can be explained by the variable that you're looking at, or the relationship that you're trying to look at, right? So the total amount of the thing that you're trying to explain, how much is that really being accounted for by the variable, the independent variable of the thing that you're trying to sort of correlate between those two. And there is tables out there. You can sort of look those up, and they're really what they're trying to get at is a small, medium, and large effect. And what that suggests is that a small effect means that there's not really that much of a difference in terms of the impact of this effects and of this variable on the other variable. There's a statistical effect, but there isn't necessarily an effect on the variable that you would write home about. But a large one is where there is it's making a really big difference on the dependent variable, or the thing that you're trying to look at. So Cohen actually has this great paper, I think it's called Things I Wish I Would Have Learnt, or something along those lines. It's from 1990. And there's a story about how he looked at the effect size. So there was a report in the Wall Street Journal where there was a change in, there was a correlation between the height of kids and their IQ level. And it was statistically significant. And so then he went and actually looked at what the actual effect size of this thing was. And he sort of pointed out that in order to get a change, I think it was from 100 IQ score to 130 IQ score, he had to grow 14 feet. And so it really didn't have whether it was statistically significant is one thing, but whether it actually makes a real difference in reality, that's another thing. So what I'm getting at here is sort of the psychologists, or one field that looks at effect sizes, but then there's other fields that look at other things that this doesn't necessarily explain. That's where I want to go with this. It doesn't necessarily explain that there is substantive effects or economic significant effects. And so that's where you would look at, if you change this thing. So it's one thing to sort of calculate the impact on IQ levels, but then you want to sort of think about, this is where economic significance is really important. This is where you want to think about, okay, if you change IQ levels of kids, does that have an impact on maybe the amount of money that they're actually going to make in the rest of their life? Does that have an impact on GDP, for example, how much a country actually makes? If we can have people grow a little bit more, a little bit faster, is that actually impacting IQ scores, which is then impacting the GDP of the entire country? And so that's where you'd want to look at like economic significance, and that's where you make a couple of assumptions of what that is. And that's also, you could also call it sort of substantive effects. Is this, so it's not only the effect size, right? So if you can think of like a manufacturing plant, right? You can have an effect size, you can have a very large effect on, maybe it is, you're maybe looking at how much some sort of managerial control impacts the performance of workers in this manufacturing plant. Well, you can have this large effect on worker productivity, but then if it's a role in the manufacturing plant that isn't necessarily all that important, or sort of consequential in the manufacturing plant, it might not have a substantive impact on the overall manufacturing of that. And then the economic significance of that is even less, or there's really no impact on that. And so the substantive impact might be on variables that are, related to something that is significant in the greater world, but then economic significance is really related to, in terms of what I'm sort of thinking about, is related to actually having the impact in this world that is related to financial outcomes or economic outcomes. Maybe it's deaths that you're going to look at. Maybe that's maybe more of a substantive impact, but also it does have an economic impact as well if you're looking at that. So being clear in terms of the effects sizes, as well as the substantive and economic effects or significance of the things that you're trying to look at, is really important to understand whether the things that you're doing actually has an impact in research, or whether this thing actually makes sense in terms of whether it's impacting the real world. And sort of quantifying that in a research paper, when you're doing these research, when you're doing the research methods or drawing up the results and those kind of things, is very important to sort of look at what is the effect size of the thing that you're trying to look at. And then as well, does it have, maybe it's a substantive effect, and that's where you have to quantify, maybe making a few assumptions of what it's going to impact. But as well as, what is the economic significance of this thing that you're actually trying to do? What is the, does it actually matter in the real world when you're trying to do this? It's, one thing to have a large effect size, but it's another thing to actually have a real world economic impact or substantive impact of this particular thing, right? So you can make people, another example is the effect size might be correlated, some sort of action might be correlated with people smiling. Well, if you smile, it might not necessarily have a very large economic impact at the end of the day. And so you want to look at that as well and sort of quantify what the economic impact is. And that's where you'd have to look at how much one unit change of something is actually impacting, the financial outcomes or substantive outcomes of the things that you're trying to look at as well. So with that, give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on another one. All right, take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.